Hello and welcome to The Inquisitive Investor. I'm your host, Parijat Garg, and in this show, we explore how the smartest investors and entrepreneurs think about business, markets, strategy, and process that help them succeed at what they do. My guest today is Ronak Omkar. Ronak is the research head and co-fund manager at PPFAS Mutual Fund. Ronak has been with the firm since 2008, starting as an intern while still at college, rising to his current position over the years. The firm is known for its deep research based long term investing process and also for the many hours of educational content that they put out about industries and other aspects of investing. In my conversation with Ronak, we talk about the investment process at PPFAS, how they generate their ideas, their investment universe, their process for learning about businesses and industries, their position sizing philosophy, and more. It is a wide ranging conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome to the Inquisitive Investor, Ronak. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm really looking forward to picking your brains about building a solid investment process.
Hey, thank you, Parja. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and great to have a chat with you.
Great. So before we dive into your investment process, I'd love for you to talk about investment philosophy at PPFAS and how it has evolved over the years. You joined right out of college, right, and during the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So how did that affect the development of your own understanding of the markets? And what are some of the lessons you've learned since then? So, talk about philosophy and then your own development and journey through that time.
Yeah. So when you put it like that, joining after the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So at that time, I didn't realize how serious it was. Of course, in hindsight, when you read about it and realize, oh my goodness, we just dodged a bullet in a way. So of course, it was a hard time to find a job in the capital markets. A lot of companies were retrenching; they were basically reducing their staff. And it was a tough time in the market. But when I graduated, so I had already done my internship just before the financial crisis had ended at PPFS, and that was actually luck. So a friend of mine, Arpit, who introduced me to PPFS, and that's how I got a chance to be an intern over there. And once I was an intern, once I saw how people worked there, it was a knowledge and learning oriented firm, growth oriented firm. I realized that this is something where I will fit right in because that's how I thought I wanted to be. And at that time, I was very naive. I had no idea about investing. I had no idea about how to analyze businesses seriously. I did it on my own, had a paper portfolio because I had no capital. So I made sure that some of these things can be used as my skills can be used in some way. I was completely out of my depth. I had no idea what I was going to get into. But at the same time, I think it's a organization that supported a lot of learning. So once they saw that I was eager to learn, I was curious to pick things up, the resources were provided to me, people provided the time to me, which is far more generous than I thought at that time for a person who was just out of college and has no idea about what he's getting into. So up until that point, my interest in finance was completely theoretical. You learn about these things. So I was an IT graduate, and from that IT graduation, all I thought was I would join some IT services company like most IT graduates in India feel like they should do. I had a placement offer in my hand, and unfortunately at that time I also picked up that finance bug. You read about how the stock market works and how investing works. And at that time, I had the worst possible start anyone can have. You feel like you read about Warren Buffett and you just wonder how can somebody become so rich by just investing? And that's the question that I had in my mind, and I wanted to understand what it was. And that took me to a totally different direction. I said, instead of working so I joke about it now, but at that time it was very serious. And I thought that instead of working for an IT company and on an IT salary, it will be better to invest in an IT company and see the cash flows grow, see the businesses grow. But yeah, it was interesting to start from that naive perspective of how investing is. Just a theoretical concept, just like reading Ben Graham, reading Buffett, all the basics. And the value investing, interestingly, was the starting point. It did not go into trading or did not go into day trading, something at that time which was sattebaji, what people call it. I'm lucky it did not start there because then it would have been a little harder to take it, that longer term process a little seriously. But because I think I picked up Buffett and his letters and his shareholder letters that he writes every year, those were very instructive to see that, okay, this is a totally different world opening up. And I think the curiosity led me to learn more about how to read annual reports, how to read businesses. And I did my MBA, internship was part of my MBA as well. the MBA was not very useful in terms of giving you practical skills. It just gives you a huge breadth of knowledge, and then as you pick up any field, like you go into marketing or finance or HR or whatever, you then go deeper into that area and learn. But I think the academic knowledge is not very useful as much as the application. As you start learning about businesses and how management principles get applied and how companies grow, that is a different experience to learn altogether, which comes on the job. It never happens during the MBA. I think the disadvantage of being an MBA without an experience is that you don't appreciate the nuance or the depth of those concepts. You just understand the theory and you just put it in your mind and you forget it after you graduate, and you don't have any sense of what the real world is like. So I think at PPFS, that was an interesting thing, that you got a taste of the real world. You saw that there is like real capital being deployed on against these companies, a portfolio is being built. And there are these principles what people call value investing, which has a long legacy of understanding. People go into that value investing as the net kind of an approach, where you buy companies based on liquidity criteria rather than looking at business growth prospects. And then it evolves into Philip Fisher, Warren Buffett, Munger kind of a model, where you actually study the company, study the industry, see how the trajectory is, and then build a portfolio out of these good quality companies. And when I saw that actually being practiced, it was an interesting thing for me to see, because it was up close. You could talk to the people who are managing it. You can ask them questions, you can learn from them directly. And there's a huge library of books to read and then discuss about the topics. And it was a great experience to start with for a beginning, as an analyst in the beginning of his career. But yeah, from the context of the financial crisis, it was a tough time. But interestingly, tough times in the market create great buying opportunities. So at that time, we see a lot of interesting companies in the portfolio which did very well in the PMS portfolio at that time. We didn't have the mutual fund then, but the philosophy was more or less the same. So as I see now, after being in PPFS for about 13 years, and when I go back and learn from at that time how they were thinking, how they were building the portfolio, how grounded people were, like Rajiv and Parag Bhai and everybody in the firm, you never had a feeling that there's something off in the market. You always felt that, okay, this is a normal day at work. You will never see any excitement or volatility in the office. You would just see a steady day at work. Everybody's calmly doing their work, reading, doing their jobs that are there, managing the portfolio. And actually the turmoil that's very interesting. If you can be equanimous in whatever is happening in the newspapers and the headlines and the TV, if you can just keep your head out of that and able to do your job well, I think that was an interesting lesson for somebody to observe at the very early stage of a career, because you knew that it is possible. And on the other hand, I don't know if people who go into an organization where it's activity every day, I don't know how it will affect the mindset. So if you know somebody like that, I would love to hear a feedback from that person as well.
We'll get somebody on the show to speak about that at some point. That's very interesting. So from the sound of it's very Buffett-like at PPFS, even back in the day. You mentioned that you had a paper portfolio. This was during MBA?
Yeah, this was during MBA, and this is before MBA. This is during my IT graduation. I was just looking at stocks and seeing what I can understand, what companies I could own. And because it was in IT, most of them were IT companies. So I did not have a real portfolio. It was just companies I wanted to track. Okay. And I just said, okay, what if I bought, say, 1,000 rupees worth of shares in this company and built a portfolio of it? There was no concept of portfolio management or sectoral allocation, diversification. It was just 5-6 companies I thought was interesting to track.
And this was before you started reading about Buffett, or
this was during the.
So given the fact that you sort of built that portfolio based on your reading about Buffett, and PPFS is also a place very much like that, what would you say was the big difference between how you thought about it, having read the books, and how you saw it practiced? What were the big differences?
The biggest difference is the historical context of how the company has evolved and that understanding. So I didn't have that. So when I tried to build a portfolio, I was looking at what is currently happening. And I had no context of why it is here to begin with. So for me, it was like out of thin air, this company is here in front of me now, and let me understand it from now onwards, what's going to happen, which is a good construct for future understanding. But without having any historical background of how the sector has evolved, how this company was before, how many competitors have come and gone, what is the context of dot-com bubble, where these companies had gone to stratospheric valuations, and now these companies' valuations are different from now. So not having a context of history, not having a context of the sectoral understanding, say, going back 5-10 years to understand, it was missing completely at that time, which I got a good grasp when I came into PPFS and started discussing ideas. I realized, okay, I need to know a little bit of the history of why it is here I mean, why this company is deserving our attention, and why does valuation make sense? And I think valuation was the trickiest part. That is the second piece I realized that that has a very nuanced understanding, which at the beginning you cannot just put a metric to it. This is a PE, this is the price to book, this is a price to free cash flow, price to sales, and that is it. Yeah, everybody can calculate that, but what is the meaning of those metrics, and is that the right metric to use for valuing any business? So all those questions were not even dealt in my notes. When I go back and see, I did not think about those things. But yeah, when I started working here, I realized that yeah, this is something where you need to focus on much later. First, to understand how the business came to be here, and is it still a good business to be looking at? Secondly, who are the people running the company? So when Buffett talks about any idiot can run a business, that was actually a very different context and a comment made in a very specific manner. But actually, it's not very easy to run a business in India or anywhere else in the world. It's a constant race with competition, constant race with obsolescence, and all those things matter when people are running the company. Are they thinking about these things? How are incentives managed? So you read about these concepts, but actually when you see them in action, how the company has performed, how the capital has been allocated, all these things start looking a little bit more real, and stakes are also very high when you start looking at it that way. But otherwise, if it's a paper portfolio, you don't burden yourself with the details. So I was very much relaxed at that time. But when you start layering all these things on top, which I learned when I started my job, I realized, okay, this is quite serious. You need to put these things into context, and then you see how the business is going to work over a period of time. Can you value it for the future then?
Right. So there are two things here that I will come back to in a bit. So you mentioned that you actually have notes from the time when you were running that paper portfolio. I think that's an important thing. We'll talk about it in psychology and process. And this other thing also, just developing an understanding of history. When you look at a new company, how do you even build? So you can read a company's annual reports for 10 years, right? But that is still not necessarily going to be enough to understand what the context was around that. So we will get into that in a bit about how do you build that sort of understanding, right? So, so we'll dive down. We'll take this, this basic philosophy of good management and understanding this stuff, and let's talk about the actual process, like the day-to-day, right? And as you know, I like to think of the investment process as basically being comprised of 5 major parts that you keep just sort of repeat over and over again, right? So I think of it as idea generation, analysis, portfolio construction, then monitoring of your portfolio on an ongoing basis, and then exits, right? And underlying that, all of that, of course, the rubric of psychology and cognitive biases. So there's the element of managing that as well. So maybe we can start with idea generation. Like what parts of your day, day-to-day activities geared towards idea generation? How do you get your ideas to begin with?
So I don't label the daily activity based on idea generation. Ideas come from a variety of sources. So for example, we have a team of analysts who track different sectors, and they are responsible to generate ideas on their own as well. But if you take a little bit step back and see where this process came from. So instead of, see, there are thousands of listed companies, okay, and we also invest internationally. So that number multiplies quite a bit. So instead of knowing that there's an ocean of ideas out there, we need to know which part of the ocean we need to go in to get the ideas that we want. So now there are certain characteristics of companies that most good long-term investors prefer. It's like the sustainable cash flow generation, market share maintenance, profitability maintenance, and not being too extremely valued. At the same time, run by people who are competent and stable, and they're going to keep the business running the same way for a long period of time. And these are very, very basic, crude, qualitative as well as quantitative metrics. You can just screen them. And once you screen them, you can build an investment universe of some of the companies you think are fitting this criteria. Now, of course, within that filter as well, you might get, say, companies. So we have an investment universe of 700 companies. Now, within that, not all the companies will be investable at any given point in time, or not all the companies will screen well for such very crude quantitative filters. So then we have to read through them. Sector by sector, the analysts will read through all the numbers. They will go through the company's history. They will build models on these companies. And then it will come to some conclusion, okay, we need to focus on some companies out of this investment universe more than some other companies. And we weed out some of them over a period of time. And we repeat this process annually so that the investment universe is refreshed every year. But we also notice that up to only 10-15% of the universe gets refreshed because of several criteria. But majority of the companies still stay in the list, which is a good sign. That means we are looking at the right area where we want to find the companies that we like, or we would preferably want to invest in going ahead. And once you have this in place, then you just know that you need to look at certain sectors, certain companies. And so for example, I'm talking from the hindsight of luxury, that we have a portfolio already built and there are some sectors we have allocated some money into. And now from here, we need to track some things. Like you mentioned, tracking is an important part. We'll come to that and discuss it later. But also from learning about new ideas, you know that what is happening in a certain area, who is competing, where the money is going, where are the new investments happening. So you keep reading about those things. And in many places, you also find unlisted competitors doing quite interesting things. And that is also a good area of interest. So I think media, scanning media articles, reading about what the company's managements have said or a competitor's managements have said, or what other analysts are talking about, reading industry trade journals, reading annual reports of companies which are in the same industry but not in your country, and what is the global context of that. Reading about some totally new technologies that are coming up. So for example, you might be aware of certain things, but there is something coming down the line which is like a new technology which might change something. The company might be on an obsolescence treadmill which they don't even know of, or they are aware of, but they are not taking any action. You're talking about cycles in various businesses. So some companies, there are cyclical elements to that business. You need to learn about those cycles as to what is happening in the demand supply of that particular commodity or a particular service that people are offering. So several aspects of reading come into play, and you try and filter the news that filter the data sources that you are reading to try and manage that to some extent. So I think idea generation comes from that. One is the quantitative filter. Secondly is constantly tracking everything, which leads you to new sources of data, and you keep updating yourself.
Okay. So the screening bit I understand, but the number of things you've said that you look for, right? So in a practical sense, right? Is this very directed reading, like for yourself? Is there a certain discipline that you say that over within so many days I need to read at least so much about a certain industry, and like are you consciously thinking of looking for obsolescence, etc., or is it more just that you read a lot and you learn to just automatically filter for useful stuff?
So I would give a context. So in the beginning, I would do so when I was very young in my career, I would do that, really cover to cover everything, and probably waste more time just reading about what is happening than to know what is contextually in that particular piece of material. Over a period of time, it gets easier because then you start filtering the context a little better. You start reading faster. You start picking up chunks that are useful for you. But here, I think it's important to differentiate that there's a general reading where you're trying to be aware of what's going on in a certain concept or certain area of technology or sector. And in the other area, you are dedicating yourself to reading a specific thing and understanding and building knowledge about that. So, for example, if a target company has been identified, that this is a company we want to know more about, then the reading is very, very targeted, very focused. You have to go through the financial filings that the company has given, the management commentary, transcripts, everything. Whatever the company management has ever said anywhere is something that you have to glance through once, at least to be aware what is said, and then try and connect it to the numbers. See that, okay, if this was said at a certain time, what happened at that particular time? Did it actually play out the way they had said it would? And some of these things are actually quite easy to do. It's just the effort. I mean, you just have to put your mind to it and see that, okay, this has been done in the past. That is the bare minimum homework anybody would have to do a targeted reading about a business or a company. And then you spread yourself out a little bit. Say that, okay, what are the peer group? Is there a comparable company? And that's a targeted part of it. That is definitely, I think, the largest chunk of reading that happens when you target yourself to a certain topic and certain area. But the general part of the reading, which is, I would say, a 30% part of your reading. I'm not giving the absolute number, but here I'm just guess that 30% of the time will go into reading new things. You have no idea about something. So for example, if somebody mentions a new term to you, that this is what is happening in, say, a virtual reality. Now you want to go and read, what is it? I mean, is there a business model there, or is it just something which is very, very new and it's in the angel investing or a seed investing phase where people are thinking about it? Or is there real capital being allocated over there? So which companies are putting money? Why are they putting money? What are the visions that they have discussed in the public domain? So some of these things you try and understand just to be aware of what's coming ahead of the curve. But the other targeted part is the more serious reading, where you know exactly what you're reading. And within that, you deep dive into certain aspects of the various business segments, product categories, services. Over there, you need far more dedicated reading. And then you also try and ask your network of extended friends and family, or you talk to experts who are in the industry. If you are lucky enough to connect with many of them, you can go to, so before pandemic, we used to go to conferences and talk to people face to face. Now it gets a little harder. But yeah, if you can connect with people online, most people are interested in talking. So you just talk to them and ask them about what the industry is doing, whether And you can reciprocate in some way that this is your understanding, is it on the right track, and just figure out how it works. And you will get anecdotal evidences from everywhere, and then you try and connect everything back to what you're reading, and it's the ongoing process. So it doesn't stop. So for example, if you do all this work and you decide that a company that you like is reasonably valued and you put it in your portfolio, then it accelerates. Then it actually, the tracking becomes more and more active. Then you say, okay, now what can go wrong? And no, where is this thing leading? Where can this company fail? Where can the competition dominate? Where can this company dominate? So all these layers you can then keep adding and keep reading about them.
Okay. So from the sound of it, basically you, in your head, effectively, you've built some sort of framework and thinking about how things sort of work. And then, as you read, you're probably hanging stuff on top of that, sort of trying to make connections, right? So I will get to that. That's an aspect of knowledge sharing. I would say that, see, you can do this as an individual, but as a team, how do you make it work so that, one person's learning gets shared with the team and you can build on each other's expertise? So that's a thing we'll get to. But before that, so like you said, once you've chosen a company to dig down on, there's a lot of work to be done, right? So let's say you've generated some ideas, and maybe you can give some idea about how many ideas you generate, let's say, in any given month or a year, and then how many of those you choose to like really deep dive into. But the first question is, like, say if you've generated, say, let's say 50 ideas a year, what is your filter process to do a quick go, no go, right? You cannot do deep dives into 50 companies. So what's your first step to say, okay, spend one day and figure out whether this is even going to work at all?
So I think the first filter is the crudest filter, and it's not very accurate. But valuation becomes a very important filter. That if we decide to deep dive into something, whether this is a company which we can right now want to buy or not. So if the valuation in terms of the 10-year average band of the valuation of that company, if it is at the very peak, then chances are we may not want to deep dive immediately, but we will keep a look at it. It's in the tracking universe. We will keep tracking it and see where the valuation ends at. But the valuation then becomes a very important point if you want to do a quick and dirty see it and ignore it. But sometimes that does disservice to the idea, because the business might be in a transformative stage and it might grow much better. The fundamentals might improve over a period of time. So what we do is we look at the numbers quickly. Each analyst has the responsibility that if they think something is promising, that this particular idea looks very interesting, we ask them to do a quick analysis and probably create an elevator pitch for the investment team. And they just mention the numbers to us. This is what has happened. This is the growth projected. This is the return ratio. This is the performance metrics. These are the key members of the management, how the changes have been in the management. And all these things are now very, very easy to find. I mean, there was a time when you had to go through all the annual reports and compile everything. But now you have so many free tools available. You can discuss them later, that you can actually do this work probably in a couple of hours time, just to get a very good idea of what the company is doing and whether we want to do a deep dive or not. And once that elevator pitch gets a go through, then the analyst's responsibility is to do the targeted reading and do the deep dive of that sector or company.
Okay. So broadly, so I hear you saying that one is just valuations, and the other is, let's say, even if the valuations are a little higher, you might actually look at the numbers and say the numbers trajectory just looks very interesting. So despite the valuation, you might want to look into it.
So in valuation, the more important thing is how much do you already know about the business. So if you have zero idea, then that valuation number makes no sense. Then the analyst has to do the effort, and the elevator pitch has to be more meaningful to actually. And then the analyst can keep coming back to us. So internally, we have discussions with the investment team, and the entire research team is present for that. And these ideas get debated. So the internal discussion is the initiating journey of that particular understanding of the company. The analyst knows most about the business, but then the investment team will ask specific questions, and we have a to and fro. And eventually, as the information keeps flowing in, as tracking happens over a period of time, and the conviction builds, and okay, this idea deserves to be in the portfolio to some extent. And look at the sectoral context, where the sector is going, has the analyst covered all these bases in terms of understanding? Then the conviction builds, and then the idea can get a place in the portfolio.
Okay, so I'll pull on that thread a little, right? So let's say you've done this elevator pitch initially, and you're sort of going ahead and saying, okay, let's analyze this more deeply. And let us assume, like you said, that let's say you have no background, right? The team doesn't really have too much of a background in the company, or maybe, so sector level, maybe you still understand, but maybe there's a new emerging thing that you don't really know about, right? So describe the process of what might an analyst, where might an analyst start and start building up that knowledge. And also within this, I think we can also talk about how that sharing happens and how does the whole team then come up to speed on a given subject.
Sure. So once the elevator pitch is approved and we decide that, okay, this is something we want to know more about a company or a sector, then the analyst starts going through the filings. I mean, that is the first place you have to go to. You have to go to the financial filings, go through the annual reports, at least for 10 years. You just get a context of what has happened. If the company has gone through some upheaval, then yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But generally, the companies we filter out have steady operating records in the past. So it's worthwhile to go through all these records, how the company behaved in past cycles, all those numbers. Then the rudimentary financial model is built, and we take care that we don't make the analyst forecast numbers in the future, because it's very hard to forecast in your initial days of understanding the business. So it's better not to forecast. Just put all the numbers in the context, just build an operating financial model, just see what has happened in the past, how the margins have moved, how the performance of the company has moved, and can we understand what is going on. So okay, you have put the numbers in. It's like looking at any 10-year history of a company in terms of financial metrics, but what has actually happened at key points in these things, and how the company is. So for example, when we see, okay, margins are growing and we are unable to understand why, that's a question the analyst has to understand. Okay, why are the margins improving? And is it improving across the industry, or is it improving only for this company? Or why have the margins remained steady? Why are the margins declining? So some of these questions, the why and how the business is operated, they try to get addressed in this process, where the analyst builds that model, and it leads to a larger discussion. So a presentation is made internally where the three key aspects of the business quality, the people quality, and the valuation of the company over a period of time, those get discussed. And after that, the analyst then has to keep tracking the company. So it has very rarely happened that something that has been pitched has been immediately added to the portfolio, because we just need time to digest everything. We have to do our own reading parallel to that, just to come up with better questions. And over a period of time, the analysts do keep discussing with the research team as to what is happening in several companies. And that also leads to some more questions. So the presentation in the end has to cover these three aspects about people, the business, and price. But some key questions keep getting asked about how the business model has evolved, what is changing, what has actually happened to sustain these financial metrics or improve the financial metrics, or what if there was a down year, what if there were several down years, how is the cyclicality of that particular industry. And of course, one important aspect is to do peer comparison, where once the peer comparison is done by the analyst, that also gets discussed in the internal discussion. And in this discussion, everybody's on the same page. So all the research team, so one person may be working on it, and the investment team may not have too much of an idea, but we will do passive reading just to get ourselves up to date as to what is happening in the sector. And the analysts, when they pitch, everybody in the team is available. The research team is available, and questions keep flying from all directions. And I think the discussion continues. So all the ideas we have discussed are actually always in motion in terms of getting discussed and what is happening. So sharing happens through basic rudimentary tools. So one is direct sharing as a presentation, and then you have email updates. Then you have one-on-one discussions about companies. Then the analyst might want us to highlight, okay, this particular aspect is more interesting, and he or she might want to deep dive into that particular aspect and explain to us as to why this thing is more important to be looked at, and the 10 other things discussed were not very important in terms of weightage given to the idea. And all these things happen continuously. So there will be stream of idea discussions continuously happening on a weekly basis to keep the investment team up to date. At the same time, investment team puts an effort to stay up to date, to ask more meaningful questions. And sometimes this process stops when we say, okay, now we have heard enough, and the price is right, seems right, and let's put this in the portfolio and give it some allocation, and make sure that it fits in the overall allocation of the portfolio as well.
Okay. So I'm going to sort of drill down a little more into, so this is common, right? People will say that read 5 years of annual reports. Now, annual reports are giant beasts, like 300 pages, right? And there's a lot of boilerplate, and there's probably some nuggets in there that are very useful. So in my own personal experience, to be honest, I keep telling people, I find very little of, if I were to trying to get, build a sense of what the company has been doing, what part of the annual report do you think is the most instructive, right? Is it the MD&A? Because the MD&A also very often is just a lot of boilerplate, right? Because in any given year, it's the same story about what has happened in the economy, etc. So what is it that you're specifically looking for in an annual report when you're reading like 10 years worth?
Sure. So before I give my answer, I think the audience watching this later on will benefit a lot if they watch the video by Professor Ashwath Damodaran, who did the same exercise as to why annual reports are becoming longer and longer in size, in number of pages, and yet becoming less and less useful. So I did that video very recently. So I think you can link it up later. But the whole process is, yeah, I agree. The annual report, most of it is boilerplate, legal language. It's very hard to make sense for anybody to know what is there to understand in that business. But what it gives you. So, for example, so let's go one by one. So, first of all, who are the people running this particular business? Who is the board of directors of this particular company? That is like the first thing that you see when you open the annual report, at least in India. If you open an Indian company's annual report. Then it's followed by director's report, which just gives director's interpretation of numbers. Again, a lot of legal language, a lot of basic stuff. But you have to keep reading these things because you need to know how to pass this information faster. Because see, not reading it is like being unaware of what was being said by the directors of the company and what is this management saying about this company in the MD&A. So that is not something you want to be unaware about. You want to be aware of what is being said. And every piece of communication is like somebody is saying something and expressing something about that particular business. Now, this is a little bit psychological, but I think that everything that is said has a meaning. So if, for example, every year a same line has been said in the annual report, copy pasted, it gives you an revelation about how the company's management thinks about this important piece of document for its shareholders. And you know that, okay, you want to then deep dive into the company's ethical understanding of how to represent themselves. So you want to ask that moral question, no, why are they just copy pasting this? Do they think this is a procedural thing or this is a meaningful way to communicate with shareholders? Because there are other aspects to communicate. There are quarterly conference calls some companies hold, which they communicate. They have these slide decks about operating metrics they provide, which communicate something else. I think every piece of document communicates some sort of attitude about the company towards the shareholders. And that is a useful feedback you should get. And in the beginning, when I started reading annual reports, I used to do the same thing. I used to feel, I'm going to read cover to cover these 10 years of annual reports and probably multiply that with number of companies in that sector. And it's going to be a huge reading pile, like, a huge thick pile of books that I have to go through. But then I realized that if I don't do it, I will be so unaware about the attitudes of different companies towards how they express themselves. I wouldn't know whether I want to build a judgment based on that, because ultimately valuation is a judgment exercise. You have to judge whether this particular company deserves the kind of valuation they're asking for in the market. That's it, period. So I think reading that gives you that nuance, whether a company is serious about communicating what their business is about and how they talk to their shareholders. Number two, when you go through all these MD&A directors report, you just get the basic understanding of what the business did in that year. Number three, you have financial statements. Now, you already have the model built. So why you would ask, would you want to go into details of looking at the P&L, looking at the schedules? But I think sometimes when you go to the schedules yourself and marry that with your understanding of accounting and how company accounts for something, sometimes you might think that companies are doing aggressive accounting. Sometimes companies are doing more conservative accounting. These are, again, methods of communication, that this is how we think. They will not explicitly tell you that, okay, we are less aggressive in this area and more conservative in this area, or we are aggressive in this area. Nobody will explicitly tell you how the business will be run. But these schedules, understanding how the schedules and notes to accounts are written, it gives you some context of how the company treats the capital that is entrusted with them, how they allocate it over a period of time, what kind of working capital mindset they have, what kind of tools they are using to manage their money better. So for example, some companies might be very savvy in doing working capital management, but not very savvy in getting the right price for the products that they sell. But some companies might do both well. How does that work? So you need to know what are the good practices and best practices in doing same things in the same industry. And when you look at these detailed numbers over a period of time, you get a trend. Okay, now this particular company, for example, has payable days which are much lower than the industry, whereas all the peers have very high payable days. Now, you might want to ask that question as an analyst. Should be curious. Okay, these numbers I have observed by reading through the annual reports and putting these numbers in the ratio analysis and seeing that, okay, this is what I see that this company is doing. Now, it is your job and duty to understand why this is happening, how it is happening, why it is relevant. And it may not be relevant. Many times it will be a very low weightage item in the overall scheme of things you have to worry about, but still you are aware. And that gives you a little bit more awareness of how the company treats the capital and other vendors in the ecosystem, supply chain participants in that company. Some of these things are obvious from those things. In the end, you have the more important part, which is the resolutions, the voting, basically, how what kind of resolutions are being floated by the company management or the board of directors. and what kind of things are expected from the investor to be voted on. And in the beginning, I never used to give too much importance to these things, but I realized that, okay, more and more corporate governance issues keep coming up with companies. It's very useful to understand how they treat some of these things. And this is again a little nuanced. So how much should a CEO's salary be, or how much stock options to be given to somebody in the company? How have they been in the longer trend of this company's management? So when you do the broad numbers, you will see, okay, some of these numbers are very obvious. Okay, the CEO or the MD is taking 2% of profit before tax. Seems like a reasonable number, but is it? I mean, do you compare this with just this company's past, or do you compare with all the peers in this company's peer group and the size of the company and the context in the industry? Was it a down year for the business, and then yet the salary was more? And was there expectation from shareholders that they have to vote in favor and all those things? So these are all nuanced things which you can learn about. And over a period of time, I would say, if you see the amount of effort that auditors have put in, because there have been so many accounting frauds all over the world, auditors are always on edge. So more and more disclosures from auditors keep coming up. And once in a while, you will find something which is, oh, this is something which can lead to a financial fraud, or which can lead to introspection about whether this company is supposed to be deep dived or not. So it may not be all the time that everything will be useful. So over a period of time, your eyes are trained, your mind gets trained to filtering stuff which is more relevant for specific companies. But if you're starting from scratch, you have no idea about the company or your business, it is highly, I cannot stress the importance. It is so important to just go through these documents at least once, because I have a different kind of a memory association. I have to read 2-3 times to just understand something. So I spend a lot more time just reading these things again and again. Sometimes they're pointless, but sometimes something just strikes you and you realize, oh, this is something I would have missed if I hadn't read it again. So maybe I think the annual report is, like I said, an expression of what the company is doing and what they did in the last year. And every year it comes out, it's a valuable piece of document and should not be ignored.
Okay, perfect. So in terms of just, you've one thing that what I hear you say is that it tells you about maybe the ethics, the way they think about various aspects of the business, etc. What is the best way to understand the actual business itself, right? Because I've seen that annual reports, at least, they tend to use words, etc., with an assumption that whoever is reading it already knows what the company sort of does, right? So how do you build that fundamental understanding of a company's process?
Absolutely. So that is the longer process. So once you've read everything, you just have a general context of what is being said by the company's management to the shareholders. But now it's your responsibility as an analyst to go out there and see whether this business actually exists or not. So they might say, okay, we have 5 factories. Have you gone there? Have you seen the factories? So it might be interesting to just check and go to the factory, ask somebody who lives there, and try and build a network of people and see, okay, is this actually existing? Is this actually working? Can you see people moving in and out, trucks going in and out, whatever? I mean, some sort of economic activity. Then if it's a consumer product, use the product. See if it's something that you can touch in your hand, you can feel it, you can taste it, whatever. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do with consumer products to know whether it's a good product or not, good quality product or not. Try and understand what the supply chain is. So nowadays you can just search for suppliers of a specific part and you get a lot of information on Google just to be aware of who are the suppliers of it. Try and go to the wholesale market and talk to people, whether this particular company buys from that particular market or not, or who is the key supplier. Can you find at least 2-3 suppliers? Who are the people who are the distributors of product? So distribution is another aspect where you get to understand the behavior of different companies. For example, if you talk to a distributor, he might say that, okay, this particular company I distribute for, they are very strict about working capital terms. We don't get too much credit because maybe we are new, but the other company is very lenient. They give us a lot of credit and we are very happy to work with them. Now, all these pieces of information are anecdotes. They are not statistically relevant data points yet, but you have to put this in context with the company's financials and see where they are in the growth stage. So a company who is fully established and their product is sought after, they may not want to be very lenient with their distributors. They might say, I'm very strict. I will maintain this much arm's length relationship. If you want to work with me, very well, the product will sell anyway. I don't need you. So a lot of times the company's behavior is different with such kind of a product or attitude, whereas a company is trying to build its market share and everything, then they have a different behavior. That gives you an understanding of where the company is. And also they'll understand you. So if, for example, you talk to somebody in the supply chain, you will know what kind of technology is being used in the backend. Sometimes you will say, okay, this company makes us send emails with Excel files. Somebody says, no, we have a direct SAP or a ERP terminal available where we can just put in the details and it gets automatically fulfilled by the company. So all these things tell you how serious companies are to organize their scale of operations, organize their growth, and it will give you some context of how well the companies are managed. So for example, if a company is at 100 crores revenue, can that company in the future be a 10,000 crore revenue company? Say maybe in a 10 years time frame or 20 years time frame is a question you want to ask, because you want to back a growing company. You don't want to back a company who is going to stay from 100 to 200 in the next 10 years. You don't want that to happen. So a lot of times, actions taken by the companies, the hiring taken by the company, talk to recruiters. I mean, there are so many recruiters available on tap. You can just talk to somebody, build a relationship with a few recruiters and talk to them about how the hiring happens in this industry, build a rapport. So it's conversation. A lot of times you have to put that feet on the street to understand, okay, what is happening somewhere, and can this data be relevant to me or not? And just accumulate data first. So without data, you have no idea what is going on. Once you accumulate everything, then you know, okay, let's try and put it together in context. So this person said about recruiting, this person said about distribution, this person said about customer engagement, this person said about marketing, and see if it fits in the whole narrative of the company which you have yourself. We are basically testing our own theory as to what we understand from reading what the company has told us. Now you try and build a real world layer on top of that. And if it's a product you have used, then it actually puts another layer on top where it's a experiential layer. You have experienced something, a product or a service, which you think is very nice. So I think then you realize, okay, now this is working in some context, not working in some context. Can we put a number to this? What if this changes? What if that changes? Then you ask a lot of what if questions, and then you take it back to the same people who you have learned from, and build that conversation. This takes a lot of time. I'm saying these things in rapid succession, but actually it is not a process which happens linearly. It's a very non-linear process. That's why it takes a lot of time to build conviction in an idea, because, okay, you have understood something. Financially, it makes perfect sense. It's a great business, great valuation, but does it really work the same way? And this becomes very complicated if a company has international operations, where you might be able to track something locally, but if it's a physical operation run internationally, then there's a lot of leap of faith involved in all these conjectures. You need to really be aware whether something can go wrong somewhere. What happens if this particular country where the company is supplying, something happens there? What about the currency movement? You have to factor all these things in and see how they have behaved in the past as well. So we put a lot of stress in investing in companies who have an operating history, a long enough operating history, so that we can study all these things. Otherwise, if it's a very new company, and unfortunately, the newer companies which may have a good operating history, a short operating history, they get penalized in this process because they get filtered out. But the longer the history is there for us to observe, we know that, okay, this company is used to working in this kind of conditions, and then they can thrive if the conditions repeat again. And some peers who may not have faced the conditions might not thrive, and the market share might go in favor of the company who has survived. So all these things matter a lot in the longer term process to understand what is really happening, to what the theory of what is happening, and to marry that over a period of time.
Right. So yeah, this, like you said, is a long set of things to do. So just, typically, what's been the fastest you've gone from an idea to decision, and the longest, let's say?
Longest is never. Some companies we have kept on learning for a long time and they have never invested, and the companies have grown in market share and size. Some of the other bias or mental hurdle is there to not cross that barrier. Shortest, I don't know. I mean, it's not about time. See, it's about also understanding. Yeah. So I wouldn't want to put a time limit on that as if it's some race that if we don't invest, the company disappears and we don't get a chance to invest in the company. Yeah. So you have to, instead of looking at it from time, I think you put a different metric to it. You say, how well do you understand something? So in the context of some technology businesses, we have taken a long time to understand how the companies have evolved. And then we decided, okay, now this company can be a large part of the portfolio. And that really helped us that, okay, now we can at least track certain things more meaningfully. And if there is some noise in some other areas, you can ignore that noise for a bit. And that is like, if you want to sleep well at night, you don't want to worry obsessively about all small details. Instead, you know what details to worry about and focus obsessively on those details. And then keep reading more in that area, keep interacting with people in that area. Just build that confidence again. Okay, this is working the way it is supposed to work. And if it is not working the way it's supposed to work, then what are we wrong in expecting something? So that you come back to your expectations. That, okay, what did we expect? What was supposed to happen? And how fast did we expect it to happen? And then that culling process happens. If it doesn't happen consecutively for a long period of time, then the company weeds out of the portfolio and something else replaces it. Okay. So I think I wouldn't put a time barrier to it, because time is it's a very I would say, exciting factor to put in, because people, because we value time value for money. I mean, we are always there. We want something to happen as soon as possible so that we are move on to the next idea. But time, I think, is a very poor metric in that sense, in building confidence at least.
Right, fair enough. So, just picking up on this idea of confidence and just moving into the next piece, like portfolio construction. Let's say how do you think about sizing? Like once you have decided, okay, this is a company we are going to put into the portfolio. A big chunk of what drives returns is actually how you size that position. Right? So how do you think about sizing? So lots of people have different structures. So what's your structure, basically, thinking about?
So I think companies we understand a little better and we have more confidence about, and these are all qualitative terms as well. So I mean, feel free to dive into those as well. But where we have higher confidence, they will get a higher part in the portfolio, and where we have less confidence or where we deliberately want to keep them smaller in the portfolio, they will not get too much allocation. And there will be again quantitative factors like liquidity in the market, and all those things matter a lot, because some companies we may be very small, and the portfolio size may be so large that even if we understand it very well, we may not get a meaningful chunk of the portfolio of the company to hold in the portfolio. Right. So it's okay. We want to expose ourselves to that idea, and we might take a small exposure in the portfolio. And where companies are large enough and there is no restriction in the liquidity, and getting in and out is not going to cause a problem in terms of price movement, or the impact cost may not be too high. We are okay to scale our positions as per the regulatory limit. So the mutual fund scheme, we have a 10% regulatory limit while buying anything in the portfolio. So we have never crossed that limit actively. So we anyway cannot cross it, but passively a few times in the past we may have crossed. But I think generally we stay below that limit itself.
Okay. So one is confidence in the company, right? How does, for example, returns expectations play into sizing?
So one thing is, you don't look at return expectations as a first criteria. That is not the first filter to use. That may come later as you start understanding the business better. Even after owning it, you start learning more about the company. You're slightly more attuned to what is happening, because tracking is different and owning is something is totally different. But when you start looking at you have built a position in the portfolio, you keep tracking the performance. So of course, when the analysts discuss the idea, there's certain expectation that the performance of the company has to be so and so, on the basis of which the valuation is something, the range of valuation that we have come is the reasonable valuation, is what we have come up to. That has to justify. But the performance falters over a long period of time, then I think the analyst has to revisit the idea as to know what went wrong in terms of the analyst expectations, what went wrong in our assumptions as investment managers to value this company in this particular way. And what if we could have bought something else? So there's always that tug of war between three things. One is a relative company, which is there in the peer set, which we could have bought. Another company which is not in the peer set but very attractive, but because we have a restriction on number of stocks we want to put in the portfolio, then what happens? And the third is cash. If nothing else is available, then cash becomes the default residual way to put that money in. So these three competing things always happen. And as investment managers, the main idea is to figure out, once you have built a sector allocation in the portfolio, within that, what companies can be churned, or if it is required to be churned. The companies are doing just fine and the valuations have not gone much ahead of the expectations, then you're okay. You can keep on owning them for a long time. I think the process that PPFS has is slightly more longer term oriented and less churn oriented. So we tolerate underperformance a little bit more, I would say that, because sometimes companies don't deliver in the next quarter or immediate quarter. It just might take a little longer to deliver that performance. So we tell our investors to invest with a 5-year horizon with the fund. So of course, it makes us also responsible that at least we will put 5-year capital at least in the company and see how the company does in that period of time. And if not, then we are a little ruthless about it. We'll say, okay, why hasn't it not done? What is the analyst expectations? How has it changed? Sometimes we might also, the analyst has changed. So that is a big problem where people change and expectations are also then realigned based on how they understand the business. But I think that 5-year barrier, it's a mental barrier. We have put a number to it. It can be 7, it can be 4, whatever. I mean, but 5 is a good barrier to have, because you might just get a general idea of how cycles have played out in that particular sector and how different companies have performed. And 5 years can actually show you the real strong performance and strong executing companies versus the poor executing companies. And prices can then reflect automatically in the market as well.
Right. But even so, sorry, I'm going to stick to that a little.
Of course. Yeah.
When you are getting into a position, right? So you might have some expectations. So you might say this is capable of doubling over the next 3 years versus say something that has a 40% upside, right? So even within the set of opportunities that you have, right? You have some expectation of, or do you even think in terms of some sort of target price at all? Or do you just say this is a great company to own and this is liquid and this is there's a low risk of things going wrong, so I'm going to put in certain percentage?
Yes.
Or do you so there's no target price per se that you have?
Because there is no see, we can put a target price, there can be a formula, there can be a DCF calculation done, you can get an answer, but that answer will only be as good as the assumptions we have made. Sometimes we will not even know what assumptions we have missed, and that may be the key assumptions that we should have made. And these are some of the mistakes that we have made in the portfolio, where we did not buy something enough, where we thought, okay, this was a good idea, why don't we put more money there? Sometimes we put a lot of money somewhere and it just realized that idea never worked out, the assumptions were wrong, something just imploded in our face. Or in some cases where we were right on the ball, we put the right amount of money and the company did well. So these all three things are part of the portfolio. So we are not saying that even despite putting all this effort, mistakes will not happen. So assumption is, the expectation is only as good as the assumptions you make. And sometimes the assumptions are completely off. We are very horrible at predicting. So we just don't force the analyst to predict an outcome, but at least understand whether trend is growing. Because see, a lot of things don't change very rapidly. People generally think, I mean, everybody thinks that, okay, things change so fast and technology is moving so fast. But on the ground, businesses cannot just steer their company's business models rapidly. There is always that period available where companies can retool themselves, update themselves and create a different business model out of it. It can be slower or faster. We can debate about that, but doesn't happen at like a light switch that okay, now you read the headline and this is going to happen immediately tomorrow morning. It doesn't happen like that. It only happens in the regulatory world where regulations can cancel something immediately. But if it's a business case that is to be built, I don't think things happen so rapidly. So you have to give time for things to play out, and at the same time track everything in that industry as to what is happening around that industry, to be aware of how this company you have invested in is getting affected by that.
Okay. So that's a nice segue into the next thing, right? Monitoring a position. So since you don't have a price target, right? So you don't really have a price expectation. How do you, what does somebody look at as an analyst? Say you're monitoring a specific position, right? How frequently is he testing whether a certain, and like you said, things don't break down immediately, right? So how frequently do you look at the various aspects of your thesis? What specific things do you look for? And also in conjunction with that, what is your documentary process for thesis? Do you have some structure where you say there's a place where any analyst can go and see, okay, what is our thesis for this company and what are the drivers? And then how frequently do you test against that hypothesis? And how quickly do you act once you think something has gone wrong?
So for recording purpose, I think as a mutual fund or any regulated investment organization, they have a lot of record keeping in place. So we have the initiating coverage that you call for a company where we have decided to buy a particular company or sell a particular company. That report has to be kept with all the assumptions and arguments written down so that you know, and also the maximum position allocation you want to give to the particular stock. And these are regulatory standards. It's not something where we do it differently than everybody else. And then every quarter, as the results come out, there's a discussion which is reported to the investment team that, okay, this has happened in this particular company. And other peer groups in the tracking universe also are tracked and their numbers are given. There's also a process where you have sell-side analysts who will pitch you ideas, who will discuss ideas with you. So the analyst has to engage with the sell-side team, sell-side analysts of different brokerage houses, and their opinions have to be understood. Okay, why is somebody saying something against our particular portfolio holding, or why is somebody too positive about our portfolio holding, and what are the time frames of these things to play out? Sometimes there might be minor shorter-term events which people might overemphasize, and they might give a sell call on something which you might hold, and which might be right. In the shorter term, the price might go down. So we are not afraid of the volatility in that particular price going down, but in the longer term, is that business being affected in a bad way? That is something we are worried about. So that is one aspect where the analyst has to interact with the sell side team. They have to do their own work as to understanding how the trends are happening in this industry. Is there some reading material which is different from what everybody else is reading? Is there a trade journal which they can read to? Is there some person they can speak to? All these things they have to keep on updating over a period of time. And then there are conversations. Right? I mean, people talk about, okay, I have read about this. I am worried about this particular thing. What do you think? Then we discuss about it. Okay, what is the data point? What is the source? What's the trend of this particular thing happening? So all these things are discussed. What is done in the peer group? So peer group comparison sometimes very interesting in companies where their business models are not too different. Their segments are very similar, and you can actually track some things very meaningfully and say, okay, this has happened over here, but what is happening over here? Why does this company grow much faster than this in the same industry, in the same conditions that they're operating in? And some of these questions get debated and addressed by the research team. And this all gets updated. So everything gets put into that common repository of that company's folder or the tracking database that we have. And this is common for all companies. So I'm not doing any new things or reinventing something. So any other meeting notes that the analyst has gathered, they are put into a central place where the investment team can go and read them over a period of time. And interestingly, as a database has been built over a period of years, you can actually go back in time and say, okay, what was the view at that time? Does it still hold true or not? And what are the subtle changes that have happened in that view? Sometimes the company is just doing what they're good at doing and they can keep doing it for years on. And the industry has not changed too much in terms of how they operate. And that's a good sign. I mean, you don't want to have too many upheaval generating changes in the companies where their actually business model might be affected, and which is a good sign. We might continue to hold that company. So there are companies in the portfolio which we have held on since the PMS days, and those companies are kept on doing well. They're also part of the mutual fund portfolio. So it's actually a good sign that a company you have backed a long time ago has now grown into a much larger company and larger business and still is in your portfolio and is still available at a reasonable price as the business has grown. And the final discussion on valuation also happens. And sometimes analysts might have a view on valuation. They might say something is too expensive, too cheap, or just right there. I mean, you can just add on to the company whenever chances are presented in the market. So those discussions also happen. But the ultimate choice lies with the investment team, where we decide whether it deserves to be added or reduced in the portfolio. Something else can be replaced. I think this constant communication, database management of all the things that we have discussed in the past is in one place. So we can always go back in time and see what how the views have evolved over a period of time. And sometimes the analyst's confidence of tracking the sector also changes as they started tracking the industry over a period of time, and they might become more confident and might have, I would say, more direct responses to something. That, okay, this is happening, then this has to be done immediately, and then you can move on from that conversation. So I think it's an individual conviction as well as the data that we have already collected. What does that say about how our view has evolved over a period of time? That can also be tracked.
So you ever have things like, if X happens, we are out? Is there a set of things like that?
Yeah.
Is there any example that you can share? Maybe not company specific, just in an abstract sense.
I'll give you a context of when it happens. So in sell decisions, it becomes very easy to come to this kind of if this happens, then you're out. So there are three primary reasons why we sell things. The number one is if the company's valuation is gone up too fast. So if you see a company which has become expensive very soon, rather than steadily going up over a period of time, because a lot of things happen in the market. There is a fancy for a particular sector or a stock or whatever, and the valuation goes to a different level altogether. And we personally feel that this is not the range we are comfortable in owning this particular business. Maybe we can get a chance later in the future, or maybe we'll just say goodbye to this business and find some other company to invest in. So that is one place where we categorically put our foot down and say, okay, now we don't want to own an expensive business. We rather think the capital can be put somewhere else, and that can serve us better in the longer run. Secondly, we have all these, like we saw the research process and we have gone through the details of everything that the company and the business does. We have made certain assumptions that these things can happen in the future, and they don't play out. And numbers are just clear that that has not happened, and there's no chance that it can happen. The company has gone too far away from the mean, and they cannot come back to the mean and also grow from that part. Then I think we have to grudgingly say that, okay, we made a mistake and we get out of that particular idea. Or some regulatory event happens where we have to sell because there's nothing that we can do. That business cannot survive a particular blow like that. Then we have to get out. And number three is which is more interesting and more challenging. It's a relative comparison where existing company and a new company we have discussed, they are fighting for allocation in the portfolio. And that's the more fun discussion to have. But yeah, that is another where we put our foot down and say, okay, this looks a little better than this, and we should stick with this, and we should say goodbye to this. So there are three very categorically, I think, defined places where we can actually say that, okay, when this happens, we are out, or when this happens, we should change something.
So like you said, right, the third part is the hardest bit, especially I think where your process is not really geared towards like calculating an upside upfront, right? then how do you compare to businesses and say this is, and maybe there are different sectors, right?
Yeah.
So what is the basis of comparison?
So trajectory of growth, our understanding evolving over a period of time. So there are companies which are in different understanding levels also. So there might be one sector we understand very well, and a company is there in the portfolio, and another sector which is upcoming in our understanding. We have now figured out, okay, we understand well enough to have a view on this particular company now. And then we realize, okay, this particular thing seems to have played out. It is not performing the way it is supposed to, but this thing is doing much better in terms of their growth metrics or their own performance metrics. See, I think in every business, of course, they are not comparable operating metrics, but there are some operating metrics which you can see that, okay, what is the growth of the trajectory of revenue? What is profitability growth, cash flow growth? What is the return on capital? Incrementally, capital generation, how much is going to happen? How much cash flow is going to be plowed back to shareholders? How much is going to go back in the business? So these calculations are same for any business. So they don't. So every business has to survive on that cash flow cycle that they are working on. And if this cash flow cycle makes more sense to us than this particular cash flow cycle, then probably back a business which has a growing trajectory of cash flow cycle, and where we benefit more by incremental cash generation rather than some company which is steady state might do well, no problem with the business at all. But maybe this is a better thing to bet, and this can grow much bigger, and this can stay where it is and grow at a much slower pace. I mean, so many variety of variables can be compared, but some of them are not very strict objective metrics. Some of them will be qualitative metrics also, where when you want to change the sector altogether. So you realize that this sector has value. We want to track this sector, but this particular thing is just doing so well. It's very hard to ignore, and it's also available at a reasonable price. And the valuation then becomes a deciding factor whether we want to switch or not.
Okay, so valuation sort of effectively, if they're somewhat similar, then you would bet on the valuation. All right. So good that actually we ended up automatically speaking about exits. So the final piece, right? This underlying at every stage, there is the question of psychology, right? And before, obviously, when we were exchanging emails about this one, right? You said that you don't want to talk about a specific company because, especially if it's in the portfolio, because it will unnecessarily make you more, change your conviction level about the company, which will be sort of. So I just thought that was a brilliant example of managing psychology and understanding these biases very well, right? So that's one. What other biases do you consciously guard against, and what are the things you do? What are the steps you take as a team to guard against these biases?
So when you say guard against them, that means there is a successful track record of us guarding very well. I don't know if we are successful or not, but there are some things which are known to us. I don't know how successful we are in avoiding them. I'm pretty sure we are making those mistakes as we speak right now in the portfolio, or in the past also we have made them. I think the most important thing from a research point of view, I have personally experienced, and I try to warn people whenever I can, is the confirmation bias, and it is so easy to get sucked into it because there's so many intelligent people around us who track the same companies that we are tracking, and we end up discussing something with somebody, and we basically borrow their thesis, investment thesis, and we think, okay, this person has said, we trust this person, so this person might have done their homework, and that confirms something that this company is good. Now, if you go with this mindset, if you go with this filter and read all the financial statements, I don't know if it is subconscious or not, but it happens that you suddenly start believing everything that is happening. Oh yeah, this makes sense. This makes sense. This is what that person said. You try and confirm everything with whatever reference point you have made in the past about a particular thing. And the same thing happens in negative sense also. Somebody has said, okay, this is so bad, you should not try this particular company at all. And you happen to come across this company, and then you say, oh yeah, somebody had said this company was so bad. Why am I seeing this company? Then you're all negative completely. You just completely are in that phase of state of mind where, okay, I want to quickly go through this because I don't think it's a company worth tracking. Somebody has warned me about this company. But why? I mean, do you really know why this company is good or bad on your own merit, on your own understanding? I think that is one thing which is a very, very difficult challenge to, overcome, because we are drowning in data from all sides. There is some opinion somewhere which is always going to be coming in our radar, and we are going to read it, and we are going to get succumbed to it. And that colors some way of looking at the new information we read about that particular business or sector. And it's very, very hard to do it. And imagine you have read everything, you understood everything, you have your own bias. And that bias itself is another confirmation bias. Just because you thought about something in the past, it operated in some way. How can you change that bias? It's very hard. I mean, there is no. So this is where documentation comes into play, where you read your own notes and see, boss, this is what you thought 5 years back. It did not play out. Why do you still hold this opinion? Then you have to change your opinion forcefully. If you have no basis to compare it with, if you have nobody to remind you that this is what you said 5 years ago, then it becomes very hard to move away from your own confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is, I think it's a very well articulated bias. It's very hard to convince people, but when you know when you see it, this is happening right now in your mind. You know exactly what you're thinking about, and you know, okay, this is a confirmation bias. Let's take a step back. Let's probably change the topic, read something else, come back to it later. Give yourself some breathing space in your mind to distract yourself from the topic at hand, and then come back to it with a fresh set of eyes, where you may have forgotten the bias and the confirmation that you have received for it.
Okay. So is that something you do as a team, where you push back and say, no, you seem to be biased to this, and or say somebody decides to play the devil's advocate? Is that something that you do?
As an investment team, your job is to play the devil's advocate. You have to ask those questions to your analysts, and it's not from a confrontational point of view. I just felt like I will poke you on a bias. We don't do that. So it's matter of conversation. That why is this assumption made right now? Where did you hear this idea first? So some of these questions you get some inference, and when we let people do some more work on those ideas and tell them, okay, let's look at this particular section more. Let's look at this particular topic in detail, and then the analysts give their feedback again. So I think it's more important to guard us also from confirmation bias, where, okay, the analyst might. So again, excitement of the analyst is not a sign that this is a good or a bad company. That you have to decide yourself as an investment team, and you have to also communicate that to the analyst. If something might look just outstanding and they might be absolutely correct, but to reach a matter of conviction where we can put it in the portfolio, there are these steps you have to go through first. Maybe we'll miss the first 50% return on that particular business. It's fine, as long as we know what we are getting it at a reasonable valuation at our understanding, which is perfectly fine. And that also will evolve. So we don't confront people by saying you are biased and this is biased and that is biased and this is wrong, that is right. It's more like a conversation where we say, okay, let's learn together. These are some things we are a little worried about. Can you help us understand this? And sometimes when reading happens, when discussions happen, we all realize, okay, this was not as great as it seemed like. So let's move on and come back to it later. Let's shelve it for a while. Let somebody else pitch us that idea later from the sell side and ask them to do the same work again. So that it also gives a difference of opinion. So we might have our own views. Let somebody else pitch their views based on their understanding. And then we can make up our mind later on. So it's never confrontational because it doesn't work. You can confront people and you will hurt somebody unnecessarily. I think it's better to just let them learn along with you. And we should also guard our confirmation bias and not put it on them. So we might have a view on the particular sector and we say, tell the analyst and discourage them. Oh, we don't like this. No, don't look at this. But actually, it might be a good idea. The analyst has to have the confidence in themselves to tell this, okay, you may think it's a bad idea, but I think for X, Y, Z reason, this idea works very well.
Okay. You also mentioned that you might be okay to buy 50% higher. And that's incredibly hard, right, for most people. So, and it's like anchoring. Like you looked at the idea at $100 and you spent 2 months studying it. It's at 150 now. I mean, just any thoughts on how do you still manage to make that purchase?
2 months might be a short time. Then it might be a valuation problem where valuation has caught up too much to the expectations. But over a period of time, so even the companies in the portfolio, they might also improve over a period of time.
Yeah.
And you are just chasing that momentum in business. You're not trying to chase the momentum in price every time, right? I mean, we are obsessed about price because that's what is visible on a day-to-day basis. But what is not visible is sometimes more important. And sometimes visibility, that also is obscured. That how is the business doing? Is it doing well? Is it the sector going to survive? Is it going to do well over a period of time? Is this particular company putting all the right capital decisions to grow over a period of time? And sometimes they put in 10 areas, but 8 of them succeed, 2 of them fail miserably. But on an average, they've done well, which is what we like in the company. And it grows over a period of time. And the prices, of course, moved along with that. You put at a higher price also because the valuations make sense. So there is one context of looking at valuations with growth in business performance, and is one aspect where you grow with expectations. So market might expect 10x more than what you may want to pay for it. And at that time, let the market do it. We will be happy sellers at that point. But if the company is doing well, if the valuations are reasonable, you just keep adding to that position. Unless you think something is going to change, then you retrench the portfolio and you make sure you sell the particular area and make room for some other idea to be in the portfolio.
Sure. All right, that's perfect. I'll move into my closing questions now. Just a couple of them. So one thing is, what's a regular source, like a magazine or some podcast, maybe an industry journal, blog, something that you consume on a regular basis, which you think is obscure? It is somewhat obscure that not many people read, but you found like it's super useful.
Too many things. I mean, I'm not sure of obscurity, because nowadays everything is shared so rapidly, so everybody's aware of all the sources. But I think from a I think magazines and journals and everything are all there. I mean, it's the same things, right? I mean, it's all the same newspapers, all the same media houses. They all come up with the same kind of views. They are colored with their own politics and all those things. Excuse me. Colored with their own politics and all their views also there. There are so what I like to read generally is to understand what is happening in a specific industry. So there might be some good Substack somewhere. There might be some blog somewhere which will do that. So I obsessively use Google keywords to come up with different. So I'm interested in a particular area. I will put in the keywords and I will track them on a regular basis. That this set of keywords I will track on a weekly basis. So I will just make sure that, okay, in this week what has happened, and in the search results you can just sort them by time and see the most recent results on top. What is the media articles in that particular period of time about a particular topic I want to read, or industry I want to read about. I'm talking about targeted reading. So this is something where you keep on targeting yourself to exposing to the right ideas you want to understand about. And then there, it can also come up in a podcast, it can come up in a YouTube video. Everything is game, right? I mean, nowadays, information is not a problem. I think the problem is how we analyze that information and what we do behaviorally with that information. I mean, do you get too excited about what you have just read and you immediately go and push the buy and sell button, or do you like sit back and relax and think about it and build some kind of understanding first, and then consciously press the buy or sell button based on your point of view? So I think information is not a problem. I don't think I'm reading something obscure that others are not reading. I keep sharing a lot of stuff on Twitter also. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just that something. So for example, I recently did a talk on semiconductor industry. There's so many things I read I had never read in my life. So for me, they were completely obscure. But for the industry analysts who already knew about them, they were like everyday reading material. So I think it's a learning curve where what I think may be obscure might actually be general reading for somebody who's an expert in that field. But I think going through the basics, like, understanding industry trends. So industry trade journals, if you know of any industry in different parts of the world, try and get their trade journals and see what they are saying about that industry. Who are people talking most that particular thing? Can you connect with them? Whatever. I mean, so many things can be done. Secondly, government statistics. So most governments have ministries have statistics that they put up on their ministry websites. You read about them because they can give you data points which you can put in some place and just play with the data afterwards. Just see what trends have been, what has been reported. Is it actually matching with the performance of their industry? Then even the industry trade bodies have several. Nowadays webinars have become so common. Everybody's talking about everything online. There's too much content in terms of audio, video available to learn about these industries and sectors. I'm sure there is somewhere something that I've definitely not read, which is more important to be read right now, but it's something you have to learn to live with. I think these basic hygiene reading things have to be done when you are targeting yourself to learn something. And over a period of time, just have a general curiosity about things operating around you. So if you see something and if you don't feel curious about how it operates, it's a tragedy. Then becoming an analyst is difficult because you don't analyze anything. You just see and you move on. So the analysis has to be a internal process. You just see something, it should drive some curiosity. And after you're satisfied understanding it, then you can move on and say, okay, let's understand something else.
Right, fair enough. So you've been investing now for what, 12 plus years now, formally. What is it that has surprised you the most in these 12 years?
So what has surprised me the most is that not much changes in our minds. So if we are stubborn about something, we'll be stubborn about those things all the time. If we are, so we are, I think personally from my experience, I've learned that it takes me a long time to change my mind. If I have already made up my mind about something, and even if I have to change my mind, it's like that bias that you mentioned, right? It's confirmation. It's my own confirmation bias which holds me back. So I've read a lot of books on biases, on behavioral finance and everything. But this thing surprised me the most, that despite being aware of everything, it is so hard to change. And that's why you need friends and peers who can just nudge you, saying that, hey, you're an idiot. What are you saying? You should look at this in this way. And that just reorients you some way. If you're in your own world and not completely aware of what's happening outside of your opinions, then you will not be a good investor. I mean, you will constantly keep on living in your own bubble. It might work for a while till the trend is in your favor. But once the trend changes, it will caught you so unawares that you will suffer a lot in financial losses, systems, or emotional losses, because you will be so committed to that idea that this has to work. You will feel personally hurt if the idea doesn't work. So I think a lot of things don't change is what I found very surprising. And what I also found interesting is that you can change them actively. There are behavior modifications you can do. It's like losing weight or gaining weight, right? If you know that you want to do something, you will find means to do it properly and in a healthy manner. So just like you can train your brain to probably it will become better than what you were in the past. But changing suddenly doesn't happen. So the most surprising thing was that. So even if somebody slaps you in your face and says data is wrong, you still want to find reasons to prove your data right rather than the actual data to be right. So yeah, a lot of things don't change is my surprising thing. And I think the meaningful successes might lie in those chances when you get a chance to change, and then you can change your mind and change the orientation of your portfolio, of your thought process, everything. That's where I think success might lie going ahead. And I'm too young to say all these things, but actually, let's see over a period of time, in my experience, how I implement these things and how it reflects in my portfolio as well.
That's such a fantastic answer. Really, really something to think about. Thanks so much for being here today, Ranak. It's been a blast. Really appreciate you taking the time and speaking so freely about your process. Thanks again.
And thank you, Parijat, for inviting me. I love talking about these things because nobody highlights these things on a day-to-day basis. So I think if it's out, I also get a chance to reflect on my own thought process. So thanks so much.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye.